You're at RT Podcast. We're about to hear a reading from Gustav Steinbrecht's Gymnasium of the Horse, provided by Classical Audio Horse Books and Gold Leaf Farms. Here we go.
Section C, Part 7, The Canter, Part 1. The attentive reader and the fairly well-schooled rider, when following the general guidelines established in the preceding chapters, will also be able to train his horse in the canter, but he should again adhere to the main principle. Ride your horse forward and set it straight. And should not forget that, in the canter as well, collection, by means of which we want to perfect this gait, must begin from behind, in that the rider causes the hind legs to move forward in a lively and decisive manner by doubly active and watchful leg aids, and always keeps them positioned in such a way that they act against the center of gravity of the body mass. In addition, the chapters about starting the young horse, bending the horse on one track, and movements on two tracks contain almost all of the important teachings for the initial development and for the perfection of the canter. If nevertheless a supplemental chapter is devoted to this gait, as it was in the earlier editions, this is done because at the canter the activity of the limbs differs significantly from that in the walk and trot, and this circumstance must be considered in the development and perfection of the canter to prevent disadvantageous consequences from resulting. As already mentioned in the chapter on starting the young horse, the canter is a natural, jump-like gait. It is composed of a series of immediately consecutive strides, with the hooves of one side reaching farther forward than those of the other side. In the freely suspended phase of each stride, the forward and downward directed weight of the horse's body, which acts in the manner of a jumping pole, is initially caught by the outside hind leg and is then transferred to the inside hind leg and the outside foreleg, which track up simultaneously to finally be transferred back in the ascending direction to again enter the freely suspended phase. To initially explain what it is that we desire to attain when working the horse at the canter, it is nothing other than to enable the horse, by way of gradually increasing gymnastic exercises, to move with ease in this gait as well in a carriage which is easy on its limbs, but ensures the rider of absolute mastery in its use, in addition to the best possible comfort. This goal, the self-carriage, can be realized at the canter, just like at the trot, only by getting the horse to relax and setting it straight through bending work, thus creating the basis on which self-carriage is founded, namely, the rider in balance with the horse. However, before we turn to answering the question of how we attain this goal, we must understand when we may begin the canter work and how we initiate it. In the chapter, Starting the Young Horse, it has already been pointed out that the canter can be of use already in the first phase of the horse's training, where the preferred goal is the development of thrust into the hands. This gait, in particular, has the advantage that it best develops this force. On the other hand, a warning was also given not to force young horses to change to the canter, particularly in the arena where they must continuously perform turns. From the advice given there not to interfere with a young, talented horse if it selects the canter itself, we can also draw the conclusion that the greater or lesser willingness with which the horse takes up the canter is always the most reliable yardstick for when we can use the canter without doing damage. Conformation and temperament of the horse will be the primary determining factors. mentioning the dangers to the soundness of their limbs inherent in premature or faulty use of the canter in young horses, the reasons that force us to restrain ourselves during the first canter should be discussed in greater detail. Although it is doubtlessly correct that the horse's natural canter has the advantage of developing the greatest thrust, this fact and the footfalls inherent to this gait, in which the two diagonal pairs of legs do not, as in the trot, alternate in supporting the load, also result in increased wear of the limbs. The body weight is thrown to the forehand with much impulsion until the inside hind leg participates sufficiently in carrying the load. The forelegs are thus used increasingly as support and are stressed slightly. This becomes particularly apparent in all turns in the arena, that is, when riding through the four corners. At that time, particularly, the outside foreleg is stressed considerably due to being forced to support the entire weight of horse and rider and push it to the side until the simultaneously stepping inside hind leg supports it sufficiently. Consequently, we must first exclude the canter during the first training phase for horses that do not carry themselves sufficiently in natural balance, that is, all clumsy, inflexible horses, and use it only after we have given them, through trot work, the necessary self-carriage and thus the ability to carry the load primarily on the hind legs. Second, we must avoid tight turns in the first canter exercises, and therefore use either continuous straight lines or a large circle whose track is curved only slightly. If a large riding ring is not available and one is forced to canter for the first time in an indoor arena, the entire arena should be used with the corners being rounded in an arc-like fashion. If these facts and recommendations are considered, the canter may also be very useful in the early stages of training, since it is the fastest way to cause the young horse to willingly yield its back muscles, takes away its barn freshness, and best prevents it from being foolish. All of these goals are also attained with much less effort on the part of the rider than in continuous trot work. Early canter work with young horses may therefore considerably facilitate and accelerate their training. After these preliminary remarks, we want to generally comment on the canter question with respect to two rather opposite opinions. We can initially admit that the teaching of earlier times, according to which the young horse was allowed to canter only after it had found its perfect balance in the walk and trot, can now be considered to be old-fashioned. On the other hand, we must qualify the statement that early canter exercises are extremely useful in the first phase of training to be accurate only conditionally. For systematic dressage training, the trot offers such great advantages that it will probably always remain its main gait. It not only brings about a degree of activity for the entire body of the horse, as is necessary for gymnastic work directed toward developing and strengthening all muscles and joints, but it is also not very stressful for the horse, since it stresses all four legs uniformly. Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that an impulsive canter is the main prerequisite for a good riding horse, not only for a soldier or the hunt or race rider, but also for those who ride only for pleasure. The canter is preferred if the rider's comfort must be considered, for example, for older people or persons of ill health, and it is justified on the promenade where one wishes to present the most advantageous picture and wishes to hold unconstrained conversations. The selection of a riding horse will therefore most certainly be based on a special test of its natural canter, particularly since innate deficiencies in this gait, just as in the walk, cannot be completely eradicated even by the most careful dressage training. While the trot can be improved considerably through appropriate work, if the horse has a good canter and displays a regular and ground-covering walk with a pure sequence of footfalls. Count Lehndorff is still correct today, writing in his book about horse breeding, that here in Germany, when we evaluate horses, we pay much too much attention to the trot, a mistake not made by the practical Englishman. If we now turn to the natural development of the canter, we should note initially that the horse, in freedom, almost always changes into the canter from the trot, although it is very well equipped by nature to start cantering from the walk, or even from the halt. The transition generally takes place in that the trotting horse moves one foreleg forward more quickly and farther out than the diagonally opposite hind leg in order to support the weight that is being moved forward. This hind leg is thus prevented from stepping forward and transfers the load that much faster to the other two diagonal legs, of which the inside hind leg by nature steps that much more forward, the more the outside hind leg remains behind. In this way there first results an impure trot, a 3-beat movement from which the horse then falls into the canter. This observation indicates that, if we want to canter a young horse during its first training phases, before we have collected the trot, we only have available the development of the canter that the horse uses naturally. Our aids will therefore reside in restraining the outside shoulder with the outside rein, thus holding back the outside foreleg to give more freedom to the inside shoulder and its foreleg, while our inside leg urges the inside hind leg to step further forward. In addition, we relieve the inner side by putting more of our weight on the outside seat bone. In this connection, it should be pointed out right away that the trained horse that starts cantering from the collected trot performs a different transition. Here, after the inside diagonal has been put down, the outside hind leg is caused to step off early by the rider's leg on the same side. Then the inside foreleg first pushes the horse's body into the freely suspended phase, and the previously put down outside hind leg reaches the ground first, earlier than the two simultaneously tracking legs of the other diagonal. In the first development of the canter, it is only important to practice a quiet canter depart with the young horse. For this purpose, the rider must not push the horse into the canter with sudden, hard, or even rough aids. Instead, he must use lightly touching leg aids, which are skillfully supported by his voice, clicking, and whip, to repeatedly ask the horse to reach out with its inside legs. Horses that tend to rush away at the trot when they receive the driving aids must always be taken back into a restrained trot tempo before the above-described driving aids are given again. Likewise, horses that are unable to carry themselves sufficiently in the canter because of insufficient natural self-carriage, and therefore soon drop back to the trot, must not be pushed back into the canter immediately with stronger aids, but instead must be returned to a quiet, regular trot by means of finely tuned aids before another attempt can be made to make them canter. In any case, all forcible actions must absolutely be avoided during these first canter exercises. If a horse still appears very awkward, usually because of an unfavorable conformation, and because of it a lack of flexibility and natural self-carriage, further canter exercises should be discontinued and the horse first confirmed in obtaining carriage and pace at the trot. Horses that frequently strike out on the wrong lead should also not be forced in any way, since this phenomenon is usually based on natural crookedness, which cannot be overcome so quickly in this phase of the horse's training. Only cross-cantering must not be permitted. In that case, the horse should gradually be returned to a moderate trot tempo and then asked again to canter. To strengthen the horse in the canter exercises should initially be very short and should only gradually be extended for longer periods of time after the horse's fitness state increases and the better the horse is able to carry itself naturally without rushing. If, in especially difficult cases, it appears that the canter would be very advantageous in the first phase of dressage training, while the trainer feels that its use would be objectionable not only for the horse's legs, but also for the rider's own safety due to an unfavorable conformation and the resulting awkwardness of the horse, it is advisable to canter such a horse initially on the lunge line for a while. This will appear to be of practical use, particularly for those horses which, due to their neck being attached in an unfavorable manner and a difficult pull, are unable to find their natural head and neck position, without which cantering is completely useless. Only with a correct head and neck position can the full thrust and push into the hands be obtained. Warming up the canter on the lunge line is done in the same way as recommended at the beginning of this book for working young horses on the lunge line. The horse is tacked up in a simple snaffle without overcheck, in side reins that correspond to the lateral bend on the intended large circle. After being started at the trot, the horse is then quietly asked to canter. The tempo must be selected so that the pace is maintained by its own impulsion. In this way, all irregularities, false canter, and cross canter will disappear on their own, particularly since the horse is required to remain on a circle. Its tendency to push its nose out will gradually disappear on its own during this work because the horse will soon let its head and pull drop as a result of the impulsion of the gait. All irregular movements and the greater weight on the shoulders are much less damaging to the legs in this type of work than if the weight of the rider were added. Due to the fact that the circular movement secured by the lunge line is much more favorable for the canter than a straight line, because on the circle the inside hind leg is asked to stride farther forward in any case, and because the somewhat restricted thrust as a result of the bent direction soon dampens any all too stormy forward movement, the horse will also understand much more quickly what it is supposed to do, and much useless effort is avoided. In any case, this work can be used to great advantage in all those cases in which it is required because of the lack of innate balance or because there is not enough time. It saves rider and horse much effort and annoyance. It is, however, more proper for dressage training if in such cases the canter is excluded until the naturally missing balance has been established well enough through systematic work at the trot. This is always the best assurance that the legs are protected. I recommend the early canter only if there is not enough time in difficult cases, and the canter must be utilized as soon as possible, or if the canter appears to be particularly desirable because of great temperament difficulties, a noticeably laid-back character, or excessive impetuosity, although physical discrepancies make its use doubtful. If now this work on the lunge line has developed to the point that the horse is able to easily carry itself in a quiet but impulsive natural canter on both hands, with a moderate attitude and without significant aids, which will generally be the case after 1 to 2 weeks, the rider should mount after some preparatory lunge work, but let his assistant hold the still attached lunge line. Usually a very advantageous change will be noticed already at the trot. The horse will take a more secure contact and improved self-carriage. Since the horse has already learned to some extent to quietly strike out at a canter from the trot without a rider, it will obey the canter aids better, and, held on the circle by the lunge line, will continue to canter quietly under the rider as long as the rider knows how to put himself in harmony with the horse by way of the correct weight distribution and quiet guidance. Once this has been practiced for a few days with the aid of the lunge line, the line can be detached for a while and attached again until it can finally be kept off altogether. If this goal has been attained, it will be better to ride through the entire arena again, since straight lines are more favorable than a circle for the development of thrust, which must always remain our main purpose. On the other hand, the circle can be used again whenever it is felt that the thrust should be moderated for a while. The described procedure allows us to use the canter as a training aid at the beginning of work, also for less well-conformed horses, without raising too many fears with respect to the safety of our person and of the horse's legs. However, if you have the time and want to proceed on the safest possible ground, you should, as already mentioned, avoid the canter until the horse is able to uniformly distribute the load to its 4 legs at the trot. Assuming that this is the way the rider proceeds, there is, of course, no general rule for when the time has come to begin with the canter. Following the principle of not cantering until the horse offers the canter itself may in some cases extend the training itself beyond the time available even under the most favorable circumstances. Yet one should not be satisfied with one's trot preparations until the horse is at least able to perform a canter depart without considerable difficulty. Too slow is always less of an error in the training of a horse than too fast, but one should not go too far with such slowness. Decisive for the evaluation of the stage of training the horse has entered should always be the degree of independence with which the horse is able to go on the bit. In the term on the bit, the on cannot be taken too literally, since when the horse goes on the bit, and no longer above the bit, it carries itself and is in a certain natural balance. If our horse has completed the lessons discussed in earlier chapters and is able to move on the bit at the trot with transitions from the shortened to the medium and the extended trot and back again on one track, we are safe to try the canter and need not worry if initially the horse exhibits some awkwardness. The principle of not asking for anything new until the horse is able to do it on the basis of the preparation it has received is probably theoretically correct, but must be qualified somewhat in practice. A certain familiarization period cannot be avoided for every new task, and only after the timidity toward the new requirement has been overcome can this principle be applied with justification. If thus a horse with unfavorable talents has been prepared to the point that it is able to perform the above-mentioned trot test, we can be certain to expect that, after a short period of familiarization, it will be able to start the canter without difficulty and maintain a quiet but impulsive natural canter. More than such a natural canter cannot yet be expected nor demanded. Although we have prepared our horse to the point that it is able to move on the bit at the trot, that is, in balance, this has not in any way been confirmed to the point that the horse can also do it at the canter. Careful work in trot exercises only enabled us to achieve what many a favorably constructed horse does naturally. If we start to canter at this point, we can only expect the natural canter, namely a canter that is performed with more weight on the forehand, that is, not on the bit but above the bit. It would also be completely wrong to assume any type of collection at the canter, even if the horse should offer this already against our expectations. Such premature shortening could easily result in irregular strides and the above-described dragging canter. It can therefore not be repeated often enough that initially shortening is not the aim, but quietness, relaxation, and regularity of the canter. These characteristics cannot be obtained through long periods of canter, but only through repeated, quiet canter departs. The horse must not display any restlessness, and the required aids must become increasingly finer and lighter. On this basis, the rider will then be able to further the canter to such a degree that the horse learns to carry itself in a quiet, natural tempo for longer periods of time. By often yielding with the reins, moving the hands up and down the crest of the neck, and patting the horse, the rider must continue to convince himself that he has firmly established the necessary natural self-carriage. The more the rider is now able to gradually collect the working trot, the more elevated, regular, and therefore more carrying the natural canter developed from it will become. The easier and calmer the horse starts the canter, the better is the first canter stride and the subsequent period of canter. The working canter then develops all on its own from the natural canter. It must at this point be emphatically stated that, at this stage of training, the rider must never attempt to obtain collection in the canter by more rein action. All attempts in this direction will only result in the horse leaning on the hands, becoming crooked, and losing its natural sequence of strides. The canter, particularly its collection, requires a much more complicated and careful development than the other gaits. Mistakes made here are very difficult to eradicate later, sometimes not at all. At this opportunity, reference should also be made quite generally to the significant difference between the first collecting work at the canter and that at the trot and walk. In the latter gaits, the rider obtains the first collection by temporarily changing from a freer to a more restrained tempo, that is, by using half halts. In the canter, however, this collection must be obtained initially only by frequent transitions obtained with fine, light aids, first from a working trot, then from the walk, with the transition to the original gait also being executed with the same light, carefully measured aids. After the collection at this gait has been improved, another transition is made to the canter, again by adhering to the above points regarding the aids, and this procedure is repeated several times. When the horse begins to understand the aids, which must gradually become finer and gentler, the intervals between half halts and canter departs can become shorter. In this way, the horse will ultimately learn to perform these transitions in response to hardly visible, almost signal-like aids. The better the half halt, the better is the preparation for the renewed canter depart. the quieter the first canter stride, and also the next following strides, particularly if the rider makes the work easier by letting the stride come out and going with the horse's movement, and if the horse does a good job, he does not skimp with his praise. With such a systematic way of proceeding, which must be carefully adapted to the particularity of the horse and its present state of training, self-carriage and, with it, the horse's throughness will gradually improve so that increased collection can now be attempted directly through special exercises, particularly the riding of tight turns, making the circle smaller and larger, counter-canter, and exercises on 2 tracks, as well as the use of half and full halts. In all these exercises, we must always remember that under all circumstances, impulsion must characterize the canter, be it a free canter or a collected canter. In the free tempo, this characteristic is generally more or less secured by the speed of movement. But in the collected tempo, we often miss it. If we paint the ideal picture of a canter that has been shortened correctly by way of collection, the spectator must gain the impression that the horse is imbued with the liveliest eagerness to go forward, although it does not gain any more ground than is possible for someone riding along at the walk. Such a canter is natural only by the spring-like activity of the 3 major joints of the hindquarters, the hip joint, the stifle, and the hock. This spring force must be developed to perfection, and the degree of its effect must be determined unconditionally by the rider's hands. The slightest pressure of the bit on the bars must be sufficient to compress the springs, which must then retain enough force to be able to immediately, elastically open when the pressure is reduced, and there is the concomitant relief. It would be foolish to expect such a canter from every horse. Only the noble horse that is willing to go forward, whom nature has given a well-conformed forehand, a back of medium length, and most importantly, strong, flexible, and well-angled hindquarters, will be able to perform it to this perfection. The rider must always have its image before his eyes during work, so that he will not be led astray while collecting the canter. If his horse has not been endowed by nature with the physical prerequisites necessary to accomplish this, it is the rider's task to develop them at least in approximation by carefully selected and systematically performed gymnastic exercises. If the horse has no willingness to go forward, there is only one way to develop it, with energetically and promptly used spurs, which can do wonders in lazy but noble and courageous horses. If the horse is lacking in blood and courage, if its basic fiber is weak, one should not hold on to dreams, because in that case the spurs will bring success only temporarily. Nature calls peremptorily here, "Cobbler, stick to your last." The described ideal collected canter, in which each stride gives birth to the next, is then also the parent of a free canter, in which the rider has the uniquely exquisite feeling that he owns the world. Yielding with his hands and moving his upper body from leaning back to sitting upright and leaning forward relieves the haunches, which now will let their thrust work with that much more joy and energy. Nevertheless, they are willing at any moment, when the reins are taken up and the upper body moves back, to take over the load again as desired. It is such an invaluable, precious feeling for the rider to be able to control the motion mechanism with just his hand, or better yet, only with the ring finger of his hand. The hind legs require no reminders from his legs or spurs, because the spirit sets their forces in motion. The weights are distributed as precisely around the rider's seat as they are around the fulcrum of a scale for weighing gold, so that a slight raising or giving with the hand, supported by indiscernible changes in direction of the upper body, is sufficient to put them in motion as desired. This feeling is so wonderful that fate allows mortals to experience it only rarely, just as moments of serene rapture are so very rare in life. Only a horse with exceptional mental and physical talents is able to grant such happiness, and this only after sensible and careful training. Although the art is unable to bring every horse to the point that it comes at least close to this ideal, it does so with some. Often attaining this goal takes a long time, which nowadays the trainer is rarely allowed to spend. The expectations in this regard have shifted in such a way that the demands placed on the poor professional are often almost ridiculous. It is not unusual that someone buys from a dealer a completely green or even ruined, unresponsive beast with an upside-down neck and broad, tight jowls, and then, as if nothing else were possible, demands from the unfortunate trainer that this abnormal creature be completely trained in a few weeks. With views regarding the training of horses as they evolve from the mentioned example, it is not surprising if many riders believe the above description of the ideal canter to be a great exaggeration, because they have never even come close to enjoying such a feeling. The eradication of physical difficulties in training is naturally a very time-consuming job and cannot be speeded up. Everyone who has ever done some sort of physical exercises should know this. So-called temperament faults, however, if that is what they really are, and not only appear to be, can be overcome, if at all, only after years of work. Frequently these faults only appear to be temperament-related and are seated in some sort of physical difficulty. To emphasize even more the picture of the ideal collected canter and the free canter developed from it, I would like to refer to the two faulty degenerations of the collected canter, namely the shortened running gallop and the clumsy dragging canter. The shortened running gallop, the reader please forgive this arbitrary designation, is characterized by showing no jump-like strides. The horse does not jump, but runs. It simply moves its legs in the sequence of the canter, usually even in a 4-beat, under a back that remains rigid and lifeless. If the observer sees a horse cantering this way, and this might make the picture clearer, coming towards him, he is unable to distinguish whether the horse is trotting or cantering because the elevation of the forehand is absent, which results when the hindquarters jump correctly underneath the horse. For the rider, this canter is characterized by a certain uncomfortably rotating feeling underneath his seat bones, which cannot find the quiet seat in the saddle that results from the good canter. This faulty canter usually is a result of the natural canter being shortened by incorrect elevation from the hands and without a pull that is through. Although this does produce a shortening of the pace because the secure contact on the bit is interrupted, and thus the thrust loses the point against which it must act. But since the back is then bent through, its flexor muscles are simultaneously relaxed too much, so that it is impossible for the horse to let its hindquarters work energetically. Horses worked in this way leave their hindquarters far behind the center of gravity, with the result that the forehand must, of course, remain low. This canter results if collection is desired too early. Usually the use of an incorrect elevation is involved, which interrupts the thrust. Obviously, such a faulty, shortened canter can be corrected only by first returning the horse to the natural canter in which it lets the thrust act correctly in a natural carriage and finds the correct sequence of strides again. Such horses will always want to take up the faulty running gallop whenever they are asked to collect. They must then immediately be put into a free tempo, and the spurs must ask their hindquarters to become more active. This driving spur, possibly supported by the whip, must also never be absent later, whenever there is an attempt at collection, until it is possible to obtain a few strides in which the hind legs jump under energetically. However, initially, collection should always be limited to only a few strides. These must be performed with the hindquarters pushed under, and then a transition to a freer tempo must follow. The correction of this faulty canter must follow the rule that no stride can be allowed in which the hindquarters are not working energetically. At this opportunity, the warning must be repeated that the rider should not have the ambition, as it is seen too often from laymen and beginners in the equestrian art, to ride the shortest possible canter. The characteristic of the canter must always be its impulsion. Shortening at the expense of impulsion is always wrong. One should never forget that the collected canter does not exist to show off. It has a practical purpose, actually a dual purpose. We use the collected canter to improve the free canter and also to have a means available to exercise our horse in a small space. Both purposes are accomplished only if the horse always has its hind legs underneath itself in lively activity. A short canter with the hindquarters hanging out behind can neither improve the free canter, nor can we throw the horse around quickly in it. The clumsy, dragging short canter is characterized already by its name. This degenerate version has something that easily misleads the unexperienced person and tempts him to even favor it instead of suppressing it as it develops. A large number of horses, particularly those which have a lazy temperament and strong hindquarters, offer a shortened canter very early because it favors their way of going and is not difficult physically for them. Such a shortened canter, however, does not have the major characteristics of this type of canter, namely liveliness and impulsion. Nevertheless, it often impresses the non-expert in spite of its flaws, which are primarily that the strides follow one another too slowly, and each time the horse lands after the freely suspended phase, the forehand is lifted too high, which people often believe is quite pretty. But whoever has felt, or at least seen a truly collected canter, can see this type of work only as a distortion. Such a dragging, short canter is useless for the horse's training because the hindquarters in no way work in the manner desired for collection. There is no spring-like compression and springing apart of all three joints of the hindquarters. These joints, which are the most powerful joints of the hindquarters, that is, the hip joint and the stifle, whose resilient activity are the major characteristics of a good collected canter, become stiff in this degenerate version, and the horse catches its clumsy strides only with its hocks. It is then obvious that such a collected canter must also remain useless for the development of this pace, since it neither improves the free canter nor the agile riding around in a small space, nor does it ensure the correct activity of the hindquarters. A uniform and correct contact with the rein will never be accomplished in this dragging canter. Instead, the horse will throw its weight more or less into the rider's hands with every one of its awkward strides, so that the rider feels a greater weight in his hands in the final phase of each stride. Here again, the horse must be asked to correct itself to a lively, free canter, from which collection can then be attempted with lively aids from spurs and whip, and repeated cadenced picking up and letting out the stride from the hands, but only for short periods. Spur and whip must ask the horse to spring off lively with its hind legs, while the hands attempt with light half-halts to return part of the impulsion generated by the hind legs back to the hindquarters, and thus make them flexible. Never must the hand act forcibly in any way, or even want to collect, because premature reaction from the hands defeats the purpose of these first canter exercises. And when working young horses, one must reject in principle any idea of collection, particularly at the canter, for longer periods of time, rarely less than 4 to 6 weeks. Only after the thrust has been developed fully and correctly will it be able to securely withstand the later rearward displacement of the load. If thrust is not fully developed, the shortening aids find no support. Premature collection either produces horses without impulsion or disobedient horses. The drive forward is the basis of all dressage training and cannot be established securely enough. Mostly, however, the apparent necessity of strong hand aids will cause us to wonder whether the use of the canter in this first stage of dressage training was appropriate at all for the horse in question. The reason for this necessity can be found only in either a great lack of skill or lack of natural carriage, caused by physical deficiencies or general physical weakness, or ultimately in a violent temperament. In the first 2 cases, the use of the natural canter, as mentioned earlier, should not be considered because it would then be connected with too much danger for the forelegs. For a violent temperament, we do not need the canter to develop thrust because this characteristic already drives the horse sufficiently into the hands in the trot as well. However, in that case, the canter might be useful for such horses because it produces the necessary calming down more quickly than the trot. If a back of considerable strength goes along with the violent temperament, early cantering is definitely advisable, because it would take too much time to moderate the temperament at the trot and to get back to relax. Both absolute necessities for being able to begin working at all. If we now assume that our different horses, the one with favorable conformation, which we were able to canter at the beginning of work, and the one with less favorable conformation, which has already been subjected to preparation on the lunge, or the more conscientious preparation in trot exercises, are at a stage where we can assume that their thrust has been sufficiently developed and has made our hand a reliable lever, it is now our task to use this lever at the canter as well in order to move the weight gradually more and more backwards until it is distributed uniformly to all 4 legs and the horse canters in balance. If it becomes evident from the above that the rider's task with respect to the canter is no different than for the development of the other gaits, it is obvious that the means to be employed will also in no way be different from those that serve primarily to distribute the weight uniformly to the 4 legs. Since such discussion would generally be only a repetition of earlier statements, we can be brief here without affecting our thoroughness. A uniform weight distribution onto the four legs can be realized only in that the skeleton, that is, the mechanical basis of the machine, that is, the horse, is given a position which moves the center of gravity, that nature has placed more onto the forehand, further to the rear. This is possible only by lowering the croup through bending the hind legs and having the hind legs step farther forward, and also by elevating head and neck, or better stated, the forehand. Both must go hand in hand, and to the extent that the elevation is a result of the lowering of the hindquarters. Any pull on the reins to pull head and neck upward and backward must, because of the yielding pull, act through the spinal column on the hindquarters to put weight on them and thus flex them as long as the rider's legs, supported by spurs and whip, have previously caused them to step underneath the body to such an extent that the through-going rein aids, the half-halts, are truly able to have a loading and thus flexing effect on the hind legs. If the thus identified goal were to be approached directly, one would doubtlessly encounter significant difficulties and decisive resistance in that the horse would stiffen its hind legs or push against the bit, or both, to make our efforts to naught. We therefore attempt to get the hind legs to step forward and to flex under the load by asking the horse to take on a carriage in which we first ask at least one hind leg to step forward underneath the load and are thus able to make it flexible. Only after each individual hind leg has been made flexible by careful work in these exercises can we expect that the horse will now be willing to flex both legs under these weight-imparting rein aids. To be able to employ this theory also to perfect the canter, we will first attempt to set our horse straight after it has been prepared one way or the other, to let the thrust of its hindquarters produce a secure contact with the hand in a quiet but impulsive natural canter with relaxed pull. To accomplish this, we must move the forehand away from the wall with both reins, primarily, however, with the outside rein, to the extent that the inside shoulder is directed in front of the inside hind leg. Doing this, we cause the spinal column to take on a slight bend about our inside leg as it results from the aids given from a bent seat. By thus asking the inside hind leg to no longer step sideways but underneath the load, we prepare the horse to perform turns and to canter correctly on a circle. Such a circle we will now use with preference for the canter work. If the horse is bent correctly, corresponding to the line of the circle makes the inside hind leg more flexible as it steps more forward at the canter in any case than the outside hind leg. The more the work on the circle makes the inside hind leg flexible and willing to change from pushing to carrying, the more the tempo of the canter will be moderated without any further action by the rider, only as a result of quiet, resilient holding of the load with the hands, and contact will become lighter. Because the horse is now a little higher in front of us and a little lower behind us, our seat will become more reclining and thus more comfortable. Yet these advantages will come about only if the horse is cantering on the circle truly in a straight carriage, with the correct flexion, so that neither the inside hind leg nor the outside hind leg ever acts sideways. Instead, both always act directly forward and against the load. The rider must watch this with the utmost care and with all means he has available, that is, with rein, leg, and weight aids. by alternating between positioning the hindquarters correctly against the forehand and positioning the forehand in front of the hindquarters. Experience shows that most green horses are, in a matter of speaking, right travers horses, and therefore have a tendency to set the right hind leg sideways instead of underneath the load. The trainer can generally eliminate this particularity only by initially riding more shoulder-in-like on the right hand and more travers-like on the left hand, particularly on a circle where there is no limiting and supporting wall. However, this one difficulty usually produces a second, namely that almost always the bend to the left becomes more correct and purer than the bend to the right. This is explained quite naturally by the fact that on the left hand, as emphasized above, it was possible, or rather necessary, to work with travers-like aids, and the travers-like carriage produces pure flexion much more easily than the shoulder-in-like carriage. The trainer must be familiar with this phenomenon, which has already been mentioned in preceding chapters, in order to act correctly when it occurs. This occurrence should not cause him to immediately leave the path he has been traveling. He should instead consider that a bent cane can become straight only by bending it to the opposite side. He should therefore calmly continue to favor a bend to the left with travers-like aids, and only after he has been feeling for a longer period of time that the tension on the right side that has been absent by nature has been developed sufficiently, should he change to produce the purity of the bend to the right, also through travers-like aids. As in the development of the trot, the straight, flexed carriage is also the secure basis for success for the development of the canter, since it is the only means for making the hind legs pliable and willing to carry in an unconstrained way. Flexion without straightness, in which both hind legs do not truly step straight ahead underneath the load, can naturally not fulfill this, its major purpose. To be able to work successfully, the trainer must have a quite infallible feeling for this, and this feeling he can acquire only if he sits in a soft seat that conforms to the horse's movements. However, the travers-like aids in the shoulder-in and the shoulder-in-like aids in the travers, the smooth transitions from travers-like aids to shoulder-in-like aids and vice versa, are the only way to establish a reliable foundation for the straight and flexed carriage of the horse in preparation for true collection. If we keep this in view as a guideline when developing the canter, then the canter will no doubt also become gradually more collected, softer, more comfortable, and more pleasant to the eye without the rider having to resort to forced and strenuous attempts at shortening, which always have an adverse effect on the purity and freshness of the pace. If exercises on curved lines are used, one should always remember that these exercises can serve their purpose only if the full development of thrust into the hands has previously been realized. Only then do the springs of the hindquarters gain the strength to remain effective even under load. In this phase of training, in which we attempt to collect the canter by bending, one should not forget to interrupt the work from time to time by a free forward gallop on a straight line in order to revive the thrust and ensure the correct contact by letting the horse stretch into the hands. Otherwise, the springs will inevitably lose their resiliency after some time. The rider will notice this very clearly when his horse, depending on the conformation of its neck and poll, either creeps behind the bit or goes above the bit. If the trainer notices this phenomenon, which is always based on an incorrect procedure, It is absolutely necessary to completely cease any collecting work for the time being, and to ride forward with energy until the thrust has been revived to the extent that the horse goes correctly on the aids and pushes away from the hands. The correct contact based on this going toward the hands and pushing away from the bit must under all circumstances be the prerequisite for any collection. A horse which goes above or behind the bit, may it perform a figure 8 in the shortest possible canter and in the smallest possible space without changing leads or 3 strides to the left, 3 strides to the right, has not become 1 iota better for practical use by learning these tricks. Performed without the correct contact, the most beautiful canter exercises do not provide the slightest assurance that the horse will not go completely out of control on a fast ride. The canter is a gait which very easily leads the unexperienced rider to incorrect shortening attempts. Not only is it a very widespread prejudice that a shortened canter is the touchstone of dressage training, the majority of horses also soon learn to escape correct work by incorrectly shortening their gaits. It can therefore not be repeated often enough to all aspiring trainers. Not shortness, but impulsion characterizes a good collected canter. However, impulsion is inseparable from correct contact. Therefore, the rider who canters more forward will do more for true collection than the rider who puts his horse to sleep in an incorrectly shortened canter. Riding forward has today become such a generally known term that it appears to be superfluous to discuss it any further. Nevertheless, I cannot banish the fear that perhaps some people still misunderstand me, since riding forward in the sense of a stable manager is by no means synonymous with riding fast. A horse that goes forward in our sense must have secure contact on the bit. That a horse that is behind the bit is not on the bit will be clear to anyone, just as generally the term above the bit is also not easily misunderstood. Yet only too frequently one encounters confusion between the two terms, leaning on the bit and on the bit. When admonishing someone, "Your horse is not on the bit," one might receive the reply, "I wouldn't know, I can hardly hold it." The pressure on the hands is considered to be a sign of the horse being on the bit, while the opposite is true. The horse that is on the bit, even if it puts weight into the rider's hands because of the action of thrust, will not make this weight an uncomfortable load because the horse has previously gained confidence in the rider's hands. The resistance developed by the horse leaning on the bit produces an uncomfortable, dying feeling in arms and hands, which must never be produced by even the fullest contact. A firm contact, which may be necessary under certain circumstances, must never become hard or rigid. It must remain soft. The light contact must then develop from it very gradually. Any horse that is on the bit must be through and must have yielded its pull. The yielding of the pull must never be attempted and achieved directly, that is, by actively putting the horse on the bit with the hands, but by impulsion generated by the hind legs. In order to enable this impulsion to travel unimpededly toward the front into the mouth and cause the horse to push away from the bit, the path to the bit must be clear, which is possible only by taking away the tension from all body parts there between. This is accomplished with bending work in conjunction with riding forward, as clearly developed in the preceding chapters. A transmissive pull must be expressed in that the horse is always willing, when asked by its rider, not only to move its head closer to its neck by yielding in the pull, but also to immediately move it away from the neck again by pushing its nose forward. The neck must be made freely mobile in both directions, forward as well as backward, and also to the sides, if it is to be considered through. The position of head and neck taken on by the horse after it yields in the pull will differ from horse to horse depending on its conformation and also on its degree of training. No absolute standard can be established. Even on the thoroughly trained horse, the position of head and neck must always be adapted to the degree of collection and must never prevent it from maintaining its balance, that is, its self-carriage. The freer the pace, the freer must be the carriage of the entire horse, and the longer must be the frame it fills out. A head carriage with the nose vertical, which is often identified as the ideal head position, even if a horse with favorable conformation is able to take it on without adverse effects in the highest degree of collection, must never be maintained after a transition to freer paces. As soon as the thrust increases, the nose must spring slightly forward and the neck must be stretched more. The horse that carries itself in balance, in self-carriage, in which thrust and carrying force are developed to such a degree that the rider is able to determine the effect of both forces at will itself correctly select its head and neck position according to the tempo of the gait, and will usually exhibit a head position in which the nose is slightly ahead of the vertical. Since, however, it can have developed its self-carriage only after all its muscles and joints had been loosened, it is also through in the pull and will be willing, when requested by the rider, to move its head temporarily into a more vertical position. If, however, the nose is already in a vertical position, it must go behind the vertical with every shortening pull on the reins. In such a position, neither self-carriage nor thoroughness are completely ensured. If the horse's conformation is unfavorable and does not permit sufficient bending of the haunches, and as a result, no elevation of the forehand, the horse will always tend to put its nose behind the vertical. As discussed in the chapter on bending the neck, it will never find a pleasant and uniform contact with the curb bit. When correcting horses that go above the bit and hollow their backs, it will usually be unavoidable that their nose initially goes behind the vertical. It will then always be the rider's task to get such horses to stretch again by riding them forward and to reject any idea of collection until the horse has accepted the bit, again going forward, and carries itself in light contact with the reins. It is probably obvious that a few words should be said at this opportunity about auxiliary reins that help put the horse on the bit, since such reins are often used for correction. Generally, the use of all auxiliary reins, without exception, is dangerous because they too easily mislead the rider. Any auxiliary rein for putting the horse on the bit, whatever name it might have, actually works well only if it doesn't work at all. What Seidler says about the use of auxiliary reins for putting the horse on the bit is the best that can be said about this subject, and I would like to refer to it here. According to Seidler, the auxiliary reins for putting the horse on the bit are intended to provide an upper limit beyond which the horse must not go. Their effect must therefore always be limited only to those moments in which the horse tries to go beyond this limit. In that case, the forward-driving aids must take care that these moments become as short as possible. That is, that the push away from the auxiliary reins happens as quickly as possible. A continuously tight auxiliary rein for putting the horse on the bit is the most disadvantageous thing imaginable, because by leaning on it, the horse continuously tensions the lower neck muscles, which it should relax. Therefore, the continuous use of such auxiliary reins is a sure way to produce an ewe neck. A horse ridden with such auxiliary reins continuously misleads the unexperienced rider by performing all its exercises in a tensioned state instead of in a relaxed state, and the horse finally becomes so accustomed to this support that when it is taken away, the horse loses its carriage and becomes unsteerable. A horse worked in this way will never carry itself, which in the end is the ultimate goal of all dressage training. Since the temptation of using the auxiliary reins in this incorrect way is very obvious for the inexperienced rider because the horse, supported by it, is able to perform some exercises which it would still be unable to do without this auxiliary means and for which it is not yet mature enough, it is advisable not to use such auxiliary reins for putting the horse on the bit at all, or at least ride without them from time to time to determine whether the rider's work is correct. To return to the canter after this short digression, I hope that the above statements made it clear what is meant by riding forward in the stable manager's sense, and that the correct contact on the bit, that is, with a yielding pull and without the support of auxiliary reins, must always be a prerequisite for any attempt at collection. As soon as the contact is no longer quite perfect and the horse begins to canter above or behind the bit, it is time to correct the contact by riding forward. If a horse is able to canter on a circle on both hands, in the correct bend, on the bit, it has unmistakably reached such a degree of preparatory collection by bending the respective inside hind leg that we can dare, without danger for impulsion and relaxation of the pace, to gradually shorten the tempo to enable us to ride counter turns and movements on 2 tracks as a means for perfecting the canter. This stage of the development of the canter very easily tempts a less experienced rider to neglect purity and impulsion of the pace in favor of shortening it. It must therefore be repeated once more that the pace must always be the most reliable yardstick for the correctness of our work. As long as the pace is regular and impulsive, in spite of being shortened, we are on the right way. As soon as it loses these characteristics, there is no doubt that we have gone beyond the degree of shortening that is appropriate for the present state of dressage training of the horse. As for all other gaits, this principle always applies for the canter. As soon as irregular, hesitant strides occur from time to time, as soon as the pace becomes dragging or running, we are on the wrong track and must think of changing it quickly in order to prevent these errors from taking root and becoming entrenched. In an orderly course of dressage training, such incorrect phenomena should of course not appear at all, but even the experienced trainer will be unable to completely avoid them all the time. The beginner must, therefore, not be surprised about such unexpected setbacks. The art of riding is an infinitely difficult art, and no one has fully become its master before age has whitened his brow. There is an unbelievable multitude of means with which the horse sometimes almost imperceptibly resists his trainer and slowly and gradually escapes the full compliance for performing the tasks requested of it. Only the incessant and most attentive study of the characteristics of the horse and the utmost precision of his feeling give the trainer, after long years of hard work, the unmistakable judgment that enables him to predict unevennesses in the path of dressage training and to avoid them. Even with the greatest of care and the most serious diligence, no one should dream that it would be possible to reach the goal smoothly and without obstacles. With every horse you take in training, if it appears to be the most evidently suitable riding horse, be prepared for disappointments, embarrassments, and fights. Then you might possibly not lose your good humor, and that is really the most important in all of our work. Also note, your horse will make progress only if you and it are friends. Even if you fight against his bad tendencies, its natural obstinacy, your dealings with the horse must always be enveloped in an aura of benevolent friendliness. A bad mood, sullenness, impatience, lack of self-control make any true progress impossible in dressage training. Whoever really wants to become a master of the equestrian art must have the ability, in addition to many other good traits, to take pleasure in overcoming difficulties per se, and such difficulties must not put him in a bad mood, but to the contrary, make him happy. To return to collecting the canter, this, as any collection of a gait, can naturally be achieved by holding back. The restraining aids, however, so as not to simply dissolve the canter, must counteract just as naturally the driving aids that maintain the impulsive pace. To get the restraining aids and the driving aids to co-act correctly, that is, to make the restraining aids go all the way to the hind legs and the driving aids to the mouth, it is necessary above all to always keep the horse straight and to prevent it from stepping sideways or from one hind leg falling out. This is the most easily available way for the horse to escape bending its hindquarters. To advantageously counteract this tendency of the horse, it will be good to use the whole arena in this stage of canter development, since the solid wall is an inestimable aid for controlling the hind legs. To truly take full advantage of the wall, we will ask the horse to take on the shoulder fore position, or the bent straight position, namely, to clarify this term once more, a carriage in which the inside shoulder is in front of the inside hind leg, but the spine is laterally bent to the appropriate degree so that the outside hind leg is forced, without being able to fall out, to act underneath the middle of the load. In the canter, more so than in the trot, the outside hind leg must be controlled. Its activity determines impulsion and roundness of the strides. These characteristics, which identify the correctly collected canter, can most quickly be reestablished if they begin to diminish in some way by putting the horse into a slight travers position. The easy continuation of the bent straight position is the only way to establish the effective cooperation of driving and restraining aids, and thus obtain true collection. During all of the trot work, this bent straight position was the basis and the starting point for all exercises with which we intended to establish balance. If it was not possible in that gait to keep the horse in this position by firmly gripping it with hands and legs like a vice, This is even more true for the canter, since it offers the horse far more ways to escape the vice by stiffening its back and hind legs, by hopping or changing leads. Only the correct distribution of the weight in a soft, flexed seat, with occasional slight leg or spur aids and maintaining the bent straight position, is able to reestablish that unconstrained state in the horse that is the only way to obtain a light, softly springing, and regular canter. In addition to the bent straight position, the success of the collecting work is determined by the correct ratio of the driving aids to the restraining aids. It is, of course, impossible to give binding rules for this, since this ratio is different for every horse, depending on its temperament and willingness to go forward. To find the ratio of the aids that matches the particularity of the horse is a matter of equestrian tact, and while the experienced, finely educated trainer will certainly hit upon it easily, the beginner should not be vexed if he has to do some experimenting. If it sometimes appears to be miraculous how riders of poor physical strength magically produce much greater performances from their horses than those with the limbs of a Hercules, this miracle is simply explained by the fact that they are the ones who have this equestrian tact that provides them with certainty the appropriate ratio of the aids. This is usually called the correct cooperation of hands and legs. Such equestrian tact can only be acquired in a soft, flexible dressage seat in which every nerve, so to speak, extends its feelers and can only be developed to the utmost by long, incessant practice. To acquire such a seat as a permanent, inalienable possession and to maintain it as such should therefore be the diligent, serious striving of any trainer-to-be, because then his feeling will also gradually develop to such a fine degree that he will be able to adjust his aids correctly relative to one another. That is all that can be said about the relationship of driving and restraining aids. The end result must be that the canter is shortened by restraining aids, but that it is enlivened and kept impulsive by the driving aids. Aside from the fact that the strength of the aids must always be carefully adapted to the nature of each individual horse, the selection of the correct moment at which they are applied is also of the greatest importance. Both types of aids, the driving aids as well as the restraining aids, must be applied in such a way that they enhance the flexibility of the hind legs. The driving aids cause them to spring off lively and step forward, while the restraining aids put weight on them and thus bend them. As emphasized earlier, the weight of the forehand must never be thrown to the hindquarters without warning. Only a hind leg that is sufficiently driven underneath the body by the rider's legs and spurs is able to accept the load and bend under it. If it has not stepped forward far enough, it will stiffen against it. This indicates that the driving aids and the restraining aids must not act at precisely the same moment, but the ones must always precede the others by a bit. The driving aids must generally be applied when the hind leg pushes off, the restraining aids shortly before it touches the ground. To apply this general principle to the canter, it is first necessary to understand that of the 3 beats of the canter stride, the second beat is the one during which the main emphasis lies. A certain calm exists on the inside hind leg and on the outside foreleg, while naturally the other 2 beats, at which the load is supported only by one leg at a time, are transition beats only. This is the reason why the canter on the forehand is particularly hard on the outside foreleg. The perfection of the canter depends mainly on the fact that the inside hind leg tracks correctly underneath the load at every stride and willingly bends under the load to then strongly push it off. A not yet fully worked horse will almost always try, if the canter is shortened, to escape having to bend the inside hind leg under the load, in which case the then only insufficiently supported load is burdened primarily onto the outside foreleg. This will particularly be the case in the canter on the right lead, since the earlier mentioned tendency of almost all green horses to set the right hind leg to the side in all gaits becomes particularly evident here. This is then also the main reason for the frequent lameness and crippling of the left foreleg. The above shows quite clearly that the shoulder fore position offers the most advantages for the collection of the canter, since it, if the horse willingly submits to it, forces the inside hind leg to step correctly underneath the load. Of course, this advantage also occurs if the horse relaxes completely in the carriage and flexion it is given, which leads me to return once more to the fact that any force is completely useless here. Moreover, one should understand that the regular use of the shoulder fore position on both hands is appropriate only if nature or training has already set the horse completely straight. Since this, however, is hardly ever the case from nature, and in the stage of training that we are presently concerned with, cannot yet have been accomplished, the wrong natural bend to the right will become evident. I want to remind you of what I have already discussed in connection with work on the circle at the canter, namely that on the left hand a more travers-like carriage will usually be necessary to fix the then outside right hind leg and thus keep the bent straight position pure. It is the only one that permits the correct interaction of the aids. But also, if, in order to effectively work the inside hind leg, one selects the shoulder fore position on the left hand as well, one should not forget to maintain the travers-like position in it, that is, to use his hands, legs, and weight distribution to prevent the outside hind leg from falling out. If we thus attempt to collect the canter by selecting the carriage of the horse in such a way that it offers advantages for working the inside hind leg, we will have to take care just as much that our active aids are directed toward this main purpose. Since any working of a hind leg must begin by using the rider's leg on the same side, supported by spur and whip, to cause this hind leg to step off at the right time and in a lively fashion, and to move further forward due to the stimulus exerted onto the stomach muscles, we come to the conclusion that the rider's inside leg must predominate during this work, while the rider's outside leg has the task of reaching a bit further back to watch the outside hind leg and counteract its tendency to escape the bent direction by falling out. The horse itself indicates to the softly and supply sitting rider the moment at which the rider's inside leg must act, in that its rib cage widens to a certain degree when the hind legs jump under, and this becomes clearly noticeable to the softly contacting rider legs. In particular, the further forward-reaching inside hind leg will produce its effect on the inside and thus in a way automatically produce this aid from the inside rider leg with every canter stride. The sensitive rider can therefore not help himself but enhance the forward movement of the inside hind leg by softly tapping his inside leg or spur against the horse's body during every stride. It is the task of the reins to correctly utilize this stepping forward of the inside hind leg underneath the load in order to load it and flex it by means of through-going half halts, which transfer the weight of the forehand to the hindquarters. As we already explained during the discussion of the shoulder N, the outside rein will here have the primary active role, while the inside rein serves the purpose, together with the rider's outside leg, of keeping the bend around the inside leg clean. Here again, the horse itself indicates to the rider the moments at which he can elevate the forehand and set it back, and thus successfully put the weight on the hindquarters through the use of rearward-inward directed half halts. These are naturally the moments at which the horse lifts itself up in front, while its outside hind leg performs the transition from one stride to the next, and takes up the load after the brief moment of suspension. Applied at this moment, the rein aid will express its influence on the immediately successive inside hind leg at the moment it is put down, and will bend it by increasing the weight that it has fetched itself. The sensitive rider will just as naturally see the necessity immediately thereafter to open the compressed springs by removing the weight, that is, by yielding with his hands. This again leads us to the realization that the essence of all good riding is to be found in the soft, pliable dressage seat in which the rider feels the horse's movements and gives the appropriate aids at the proper time as a result of this feeling. However, the above discussed aids will become fully effective only if the rider supports them with the correct weight distribution. In this respect, the rider can only be referred to the already repeatedly emphasized principle of distributing his weight in such a way that the gravity lines of rider and horse coincide at any time so that both bodies may truly be considered as one. Since the shortened canter can only be called a collected canter if the majority of the load is carried by the haunches, the rider will keep his upper body slightly leaning back, and thus, in the manner required by the increased flexion of the inside hind leg, move his inside hip forward and put more weight on the inside stirrup. Doing this, he must take care, however, that he follows the horse's forward movement well in this position, so that his weight at no time inhibits it. This can be accomplished in particular by a somewhat forward-positioned outside shoulder. Although in a correct collected canter, the horse will indicate this weight distribution to the rider automatically, it is in no way an established fact that he must remain in this position as if bound by a spell. The work with the horse will often give him cause to change his position in order to fix problems that have developed. In particular, he will change from a leaning back position of his upper body to a leaning forward position in order to relieve the haunches if he feels that the horse puts too much weight on its hind legs and remains flexed, thus no longer being able to push off the load. This occurs easily in naturally soft and flexible horses. If during this load-relieving forward inclination of his upper body, the inside spur gives it slightly touching aids in rhythm of the strides, this is one of the most emphatic means to enhance the strong push of the hind legs away from the ground, the so-called trill. Also, if the horse does not sufficiently bend its hind legs under the load, but stiffens up against it, this happens usually if the weight is not transferred to the hindquarters in stages, but too suddenly. The rider must not make the so frequently seen error of trying to force the hind legs to flex by further increasing the load. This would only result in the hindquarters continuing the resistance with their strong upper joints and bending only in the fetlock joints, or at most also in the hocks, which would have a highly deleterious effect on these weaker parts. The understanding trainer will instead properly recognize the reasons for this action and will try in this case as well to relieve the hindquarters by leaning his upper body forward and increasing the tempo, to then later return the load to the hindquarters gradually in a soft and unconstrained manner. The lateral distribution of the rider's weight must also depend only on the circumstances. If, therefore, the correct collected canter brings about more weight on the inside stirrup, or, which means the same, more pressure on the inside seat bone, the rider will change this weight distribution if necessary, and, under certain circumstances, even put more weight on the outside stirrup and seat bone to emphatically support his outside leg in controlling the outside hind leg. If we have thus compiled the main principles according to which we will proceed in collecting the canter, any not quite inexperienced rider will know that this work creates numerous problems that must be solved according to his own equestrian tact. To avoid serious embarrassments, one should again remember the basic rule: ride your horse forward and set it straight. This applies to any work, yes, any time one sits astride a horse, be it cross-country, in front of an obstacle, be it in the arena during highly collected dressage movements. Whoever knows to maintain the forward drive during collecting work and to always correctly adjust forehand and hindquarters relative to one another will never be seriously at a loss for action. If the beginner, nevertheless, is in this predicament, he must certainly have violated the above principle. But he should not be discouraged, since no man is born a master of his craft. He should merely be careful that he not blame the horse for the resulting difficulties and stubbornly insist on continuing the work. Instead, he should quietly stop the collecting work and return to riding his horse through the whole arena in an impulsive canter, or better yet, truly forward outside to get him on the bit. Then, from this basis, he will be able to renew his efforts to collect the horse, but with greater caution. In this stage of dressage training, which involves the collection of the canter, pace and contact always remain visible and noticeable characteristics that indicate whether our work is correct. As long as the canter strides follow one another regularly, are round and fluid, and we are able to move the weight from the forehand to the hindquarters with a yielding pull by way of light half-halts that are adapted to the rhythm of the movement, we are on the right track. If this no longer is the case, we have made a mistake, which must be corrected almost exclusively by immediately returning again to a freer tempo. With respect to the position of head and neck, I want to emphasize once more that the elevation of the forehand, although it accompanies the collected canter, nevertheless is produced much more by bending the haunches than by rein aids directed toward the rear. And even if the horse has a good back and strong hindquarters, such elevation must absolutely be connected with throughness. to use the so-called high elevation to overcome a tight back, that is, to raise the head and neck so that the nose is almost in a horizontal position, is a risky undertaking against which I advise under all circumstances because it thoroughly interferes with the sequence of movements. Now that we have furthered our horse with patience and consideration to the point that it is able to carry itself on its own on straight and curved lines without requiring any other aids than those that come on their own from the rider's soft, flexible, balanced seat, and we easily feel the inside hind leg underneath us during every stride, the time has come to move on to further perfect the pace and to prepare the horse for practical use by changing to the counter canter. The counter canter is an extremely effective training aid, particularly because we have the wall on the inside, so that there always is a barrier against the horse's tendency to prevent the inside hind leg from flexing by stepping to the side. If we were able in the regular canter, where the outside hind leg is controlled with the support of the wall, to direct our aids more toward controlling and bending the inside hind leg, the counter canter enables us to direct our attention more toward working the outside hind leg. Its increased activity naturally also enhances the activity of the inside hind leg. In the regular canter, we had to limit ourselves usually to just watching the outside hind leg, since it was rather difficult, for the purpose of giving active aids, to keep the inside hind leg stepping underneath the load without force, and thus making it so flexible that it receives the load and pushes it off again with relaxed joints, which is the primary prerequisite for a good collected canter. In the counter canter, however, in which the wall ensures us control of the inside hind leg, there is no obstacle to actively working the outside hind leg, so that impulsion and rounding of the strides, as already indicated in connection with the regular canter, gain considerably. The counter canter, therefore, makes it possible for us to give lively aids of both types, as we were allowed to use them in the regular canter, without having to fear that the horse would escape them, either by stepping out with the inside hind leg or by changing leads. If we have waited to put our horse in the bent straight position until the counter canter, in the counter shoulder M position, with cadenced half halts of the outside rein directed toward the inside hind leg, and if we drive the outside hind leg energetically forward with the outside spur, we are able in a way to canter with every stride onto the wall that holds the inside hind leg. It is not difficult to see that this gives us a highly impressive means to push the horse together in itself in the canter. This would be possible to an exponentially increased degree in the corners on a circle and in all other turns, if here the absence of the supporting wall would not force us to pay increased attention to controlling the inside hind leg. Since, however, the horse, in order to remain in the counter canter during a turn, is unable to manage without an emphatic support of the load by the inside hind leg, it is not so difficult to hold it in these counter turns, and no interference is necessary with the energetic forward driving of the outside hind leg and the repeated half halts from the outside rein to relieve the forehand, which are here necessary to a particular degree. If thus the counter canter gives us great power over the horse, it also harbors the danger of misuse for the unexperienced rider, and it should therefore again be pointed out that the correctness of the work must always be checked through pace and contact. Here, as in all exercises which require very energetic activity from the horse, one should not forget to carefully adapt the length of the sessions to the capability of the horse, and at any time better make them too short than too long. Nothing is more inducive to taking away the joy and desire of the horse than endless sessions of very hard work. At this opportunity, a few words should be devoted to the length of the work at all, since this is of unbelievable importance for its result. If one sees many riders whose horses are able to perform all kinds of movements, but have a dead mouth and a weak way of going, giving a sad and weary impression, the reason is only that the poor animals have broken hearts as a result of unreasonable overwork, and any true friend of the noble horse will give more recognition to those riders whose horses know only the natural paces, but exhibit strength and eagerness, as well as a friendly, lively expression. Knowledge of theory, diligence, and skill alone are not enough in the training of horses. If true love for this beautiful and lovable creature and an intimate understanding of its nature are not connected with it, I therefore beg of any young colleague in my field to always carefully observe his horse when it is working, to see that it does not lose its fire and power, so that he does not end up with a dead machine, which is no fun to ride for anyone. To briefly discuss the technique of the counter-canter work, it will be necessary here, as in all new exercises, to precede the actual work with a certain introductory procedure, and this movement will be taught to the horse most easily by simply making the first attempt at counter-canter so that it directly follows the regular canter without a change of lead. After the collected canter has been developed to the above-described perfection, it will not be difficult for the horse to perform closer turns in it as well. The hindquarters must then carry the greater portion of the load. The inside hind leg is driven well underneath the center of gravity by the active inside spur, but is restrained sufficiently by the rider's leg on the same side. Once we have asked our horse in training to depart at the regular canter, we will use the corner after a long side of the arena to change to the other hand by performing a reversal, and will attempt to continue the canter unchanged through one or two corners, which we round nicely. We will use the outside rein and leg and more pressure on the outside seat bone to hold the outside hind leg. If this is possible, we will stop the horse and praise it. If it is not possible, we go quietly back to the other hand and repeat the exercise until the horse understands us. If our horse is sufficiently prepared in the collected canter, it is physically able to perform the counter-canter, and it can then only be a question of understanding. If it turns out, however, quite clearly that the new requirement faces physical difficulties, this is definite proof that the collected canter had not been confirmed sufficiently. In that case, it would be completely wrong to force the counter-canter. Instead, one must continue patiently to practice the collected canter on the correct lead until the horse has become more independent in it. When our horse has performed the described first counter-canter on both hands, this is sufficient for the first lesson. Gradually, we then increase our demands, and the more familiar the horse becomes with the counter-canter, the more we use it as a means to perfect the gait. With increasing certainty, we initially cease using our body weight to restrain the outside hind leg and take on the natural weight distribution again, in which, as in every exercise on curved lines, The lowering of the horse's inside hip brings with it increased pressure on the inside stirrup and increased weight on the inside seat bone. If this reestablishes the correct weight ratio on the inside hind leg, we can accomplish it even more emphatically by gradually directing the half halts from the outside rein, that initially were directed toward the outside hind leg, more toward the inside hind leg, to thus put weight on it and flex it. If the rider's outside leg is the sole means for controlling the outside hind leg, and simultaneously there is a slight rhythmical touch with the outside spur to enhance the lively push-off and forward striding of this hind leg, we have reached that stage of training in which the counter-canter is so outstandingly useful, since it, like no other exercise, develops the lively forward jumping of the hindquarters, their so-called trill, which is the basis for all further canter movements, the radop, and turns on the hindquarters at the canter. Gradually, we then increase our demands and change from the whole arena to the circle, from which we then change to tighter turns and lines with greater curvatures. It must be pointed out in this connection that all turns at the counter-canter are useful only if we are able to maintain in them the bent seat with the correct weight distribution toward the inside and the half halts from the outside rein, which put weight on the inside hind leg. The stage of perfection to which we elevate the canter by way of the correct counter-canter work entitles us to set our eye now toward the ultimate goal, namely canter turns about the hindquarters. These turns, which becoming tighter and tighter, reach their peak in the pirouette, are the beautiful result of systematic and diligent canter work. A well-constructed and noble horse that has reached this level of training will give his rider the sublime feeling of being the master of his destiny, be it in the arena for giving an eye-catching performance, be it on the drill ground, be it on the serious battlefield. Only about the hindquarters and only at the canter are we able to turn our horse securely in the smallest space with agility and decorum. These short canter turns about the hindquarters can only be performed on the inside hind leg, which, the tighter the turns become, must carry the load more on its own, while the other three legs, particularly the outside hind leg, only perform the role of supporting the load for short instances, and returning it again and again to the inside hind leg. It is therefore obvious that only the perfected flexibility of the inside hind leg, connected with an elasticity which is able to push off the weight of horse and rider elastically at any time, enable the horse to perform such turns. Although the counter-canter has established the foundation for this development of the hind leg, it is nevertheless not possible to change directly from the counter-canter to the turns on the hindquarters. Instead, we can achieve the required flexibility and resiliency of the inside hind leg in an unforced manner, only by way of lateral movements at the canter. If so far we have asked the horse usually to take on the bent straight shoulder-fore position at the regular canter as well as at the counter-canter, we now increase this position gradually to the half-shoulder end position. This position is certainly opposite to the way in which the untrained horse likes to canter, and it is therefore able to maintain it in a regular and forceful collected canter only with considerable effort of flexibility and strength on the part of the inside hind leg. Although correctly performed work in the preceding lessons particularly at the counter-canter, may have enabled the strong and talented horse to take on this position. It is nevertheless certainly appropriate to proceed only centimeter by centimeter when increasing the lateral position. With respect to seat and aids in this lesson, reference is made to the chapter on the shoulder in, and it need only be particularly emphasized at this occasion that the shoulder in position is useful only if the flexion is pure, and this in turn is dependent primarily on the correct control of the outside hind leg. The idea that an increase in the lateral position is useless if it is at the expense of flexion must be emphasized even more at this point, since the difficulty of a shoulder-in canter very easily causes the horse to escape in an incorrect bend. It should therefore be sufficient, particularly for horses that have an unfavorable conformation and are not very strong, to take on a lesser lateral position. Such horses should not go beyond the half shoulder in position. For the understanding trainer, it needs no mention that for such a difficult lesson, the length of the session must be short. It is advisable to push the horse straight forward with both legs from the shoulder-in canter and to change to a circle on one track, or, if the horse approaches a corner in the shoulder-in canter, to push straight forward as if one wanted to change to the travers and to continue cantering on one track out of the corner. If one believes to have sufficiently furthered the flexibility and suppleness of the entire horse through the shoulder-in canter, and particularly the spring-like activity of the inside hind leg, one may dare to make the first attempt at a more distinct travers canter out of the corner in a transition from the shoulder-in position. The travers position is enhanced considerably by the canter movement, and is therefore generally gladly accepted by the horse, particularly on the right hand. The not expertly educated rider is usually surprised that the travers canter is called a higher level movement, and believes to be performing such a movement if he pushes his horse's croup inside at the canter. The expert, however, is well aware of the difficulties of the correct travers canter and dares to assume the specific travers position only after his horse has been carefully prepared for it in the above described stages of canter work. The difficulties of the travers canter are based particularly on the fact that the cantering horse by nature tends to push its croup inside, as anyone will understand who has followed our discussions to this point. The lateral position taken on by the untrained horse does not exhibit any rib cage flexion, and the inside hind leg is set down to the side of the outside hind leg because it is lacking in flexibility. The essence of the true travers canter, however, is a perfectly pure lateral bend of the entire spinal column, with its degree being in full harmony with that of the lateral position, and, connected with it, the inside hind leg is put forward in the direction toward the center of gravity, closely past the outside hind leg. The system developed in this book continues to adhere to the principle that all movements of true classical dressage have direct or indirect practical utility, and it emphatically contradicts the unfortunately so widespread erroneous opinion that the only purpose of dressage is to present the horse in artificial positions and movements. The travers canter, in particular, is one of the dressage movements which has a direct practical purpose, since it is perfectly suited to prepare and enable the horse for turns on the hindquarters. The travers canter is, of course, able to fulfill this purpose only if it embodies the above-mentioned characteristics. A turn about the hindquarters is possible only if the inside hind leg is under the weight mass at the moment of the turn. A good travers at the canter, in which the inside hind leg jumps underneath the body in the direction toward the center of gravity, is conceivable only with a uniform, albeit slight, lateral flexion, since the unbent horse would always tend to canter straight ahead instead of sideways. The above statements will hopefully have contributed to everyone's understanding that the correct travers canter can be developed only from a correct shoulder-in canter. Just as in the other gaits, the proper dressage travers can be established only on careful preparation of the shoulder-in. For this reason, it has also been recommended to develop the transition to the travers canter in the described manner from the shoulder-in canter, because this is the best way to obtain the necessary correct longitudinal flexion and to carry it over into the travers canter. Moreover, I must here again refer to the chapter about the travers, and particularly to the fact that a flowing regular pace is conceivable only if the inside hind leg works correctly after being asked by the rider's leg and spur on the same side to step diligently forward, and both reins, especially the inside rein, continue to move the forehand to the side, particularly in the turns. From the travers canter, we will guide our horse to the counter travers canter, or the renvers canter, and there find the means to give the gait its ultimate perfection. We then have the wall behind us and are permitted to use stronger half-halts, which continue to increase the flexion of the hindquarters produced by the weight, and make the canter stride ever more elevated. If we have already warned, in connection with the counter canter, that the rider should not misuse the power that this movement gives him, this is even more true here. If the horse's capabilities to perform are exceeded, resistance will suddenly and unexpectedly arise, and the entire structure, set up with so much care and consideration, will collapse like a house of cards, unless the rider can fall back on very mature experience. Most of all, the rider should again call to mind the two major principles: ride your horse forward and set it straight. Or stated differently, always take care that the forehand is leading the hindquarters. As soon as this rule is neglected, and the horse is permitted, by letting it drag its forehand, to put the inside hind leg to the side, it would be very magnanimous of the horse if it did not take this opportunity to remove itself from the rider's authority. Almost every horse will not give up such an opportunity, and will be even more willing to take advantage of it the more the rider asks it for a performance that goes beyond its capabilities, and the more its temperament puts it either into an annoyed or irritated state. To avoid repetitions, reference is made here to the chapter on the renvers, which also applies for the renvers canter. The more harmoniously a horse is constructed, the stronger its hindquarters, the more lively and willing its temperament, the more elevated will be its stride in the travers and renvers canter, until finally the outer diagonal, the inside hind leg, and the outside foreleg will track separately. That is, the 3-beat becomes a 4-beat, and the travers and renvers canter have become a redopp and counter redopp, respectively. This upper-level dressage movement is often misunderstood, and a certain dragging canter of some horses is thought to be a redopp. The redopp differs considerably from such a faulty, dragging canter, which I have mentioned occasionally in this chapter, and against which the understanding trainer will take decisive countermeasures by the energetic, trill-like jumping under of the hindquarters. The forehand is set down softly, as if the forelegs were trying not to touch the ground. A reidop is a dressage movement that only very gifted horses are able to perform. In them it develops from the travers and renvers canter, practically without any special assistance from the rider. Forcing less talented horses to perform this canter movement would be foolish, because the result would always be only poor and would adversely affect the overall training. At the conclusion of our canter work, we crown it with turns on the hindquarters. In the travers work, we always had the opportunity to prepare such turns in the corners, and with increasing proficiency in the travers and renvers canter, we will have occasionally interrupted our track along the whole arena by a turn or a transition to a circle. To now develop the turns on the hindquarters to their utmost perfection, we go on a circle in the travers canter or the reidop and gradually reduce the size of the circle. This exercise is very suitable to further enhance the elevation of the forehand when the hindquarters land, and to ask the latter to fully take over the load, since this movement by nature also permits us to use strong half halts. The rider's legs must of course always produce the corresponding counter aid to these half halts. The inside spur, in particular, must ask the inside hind leg at the proper time to willingly take up the load it is supposed to carry, when the outside hind leg willingly follows the sideways driving aids. As long as the horse still tends to fall out with the outside hind leg, the rider's outside leg must predominate, frequently supported by the outside rein, and even by increased weight on the outside seat bone, as the control of the outside hind leg is the basic condition for the correct performance of this movement. With this predominant use of his outside leg, the rider must, however, be particularly careful that the forehand always properly precedes the hindquarters, since only in this way can the correct lateral flexion and the flow of the movement be maintained. The more perfect the travers canter was, the more it became a reidop, the more we will be able to reduce the circle, until finally we come to the pirouette, in which the inside hind leg works on the pivot point around which the forehand turns in reidop strides. The number of strides the horse needs for a pirouette depends on its strength, agility, and liveliness. The fewer strides, the more beautiful is the pirouette. There are a few extraordinarily gifted horses which, with increasing practice, become able to perform the pirouette in one sweep or stride, while the number of those who get around in 2 strides is somewhat larger, although this movement is also not the forte of every horse. At this opportunity, it should be stated once and for all that the training of horses, although it is a systematic whole from the first beginnings to its highest perfection, in which one lesson logically develops out of another, one must nevertheless not believe that every horse can be trained over time to perform the highest level dressage movements. Nature has placed very defined limits here, which bring very severe consequences if exceeded. The experienced trainer very soon discovers these limits in each horse. The unexperienced rider, however, must be urgently advised that he better be too modest in his expectations and requirements than setting them too high, which unfortunately most riders have a tendency to do. Systematic and logical training of the horse brings the result that a horse, when trained quietly and expertly, will occasionally indicate itself that it is ready for the next movement. The principle can therefore be established that demands can be increased as long as one feels that his horse exhibits a certain willingness. To return now to the pirouette, everyone will understand that it can be performed in but approximate perfection only by a horse whose strength and courage are sufficient to increase the travers canter to the redopp, since of course the pirouette requires a decisive elevation of the forehand on hindquarters that jump underneath it. With less talented horses, one will have to be satisfied to reduce the size of the circle only to the extent that the inside hind leg describes the smallest possible circle. In this connection, it should also be pointed out that the smaller the circle becomes, the horse will have more of a tendency to escape by its hindquarters falling out, and that therefore the rider's outside leg, rein, and seat bone must control the outside hind leg that much more, while his inside leg and seat bone maintain forward movement. After we now have developed the reduction of the circle to a certain degree of reliability, we can occasionally interrupt the straight line at various locations in the arena, depending on the performance capability of the horse, by a travers canter or redopp voltes, by quarter, half, and whole pirouettes, or by corresponding turns about the hindquarters, and would thus have arrived at the perfection of our canter work if we did not also have to develop the changes of lead in the canter. The so-called flying changes of lead are also not every horse's strength, since they require a certain agility and liveliness to be performed properly and without deleterious results. If one were to force a fat, phlegmatic horse to do flying changes, it would break its bones and still not bring about a good change. Here again, the horse will indicate to the attentive rider precisely how far it is able to go. Every talented horse, the stronger, more flexible, and sensitive it has become from its gymnastic work, will offer the flying change that much more easily if the rider skillfully changes seat and guidance when changing from one lead to the other. The flying change of lead should not be made a special exercise too early, and one should especially not begin with it until the horse performs the simple change with increasing skill and gradually more securely and promptly. Before we turn to the manner of its performance and the required aids, we want to explain again in connection with this exercise how the horse naturally uses its limbs. In the state of freedom, we can also often observe the horse performing flying changes at the canter. The sequence of footfalls at the canter makes it evident that a change of lead in this gait can occur only during the period of suspension in which the horse, after its inside foreleg has pushed the body off the ground, pulls all four of its legs underneath its body for a very short moment, to be able to catch the body now not with the previously outside hind leg, but with the other hind leg. The latter must be given more weight and directed underneath the body mass, while the former is relieved and is asked, while still in the air, to pull up more and swing forward so that it will land later than the first. If we bring to mind the natural aids that this requires, the rider will primarily take his weight off the previously outside legs and cause them to swing forward while still in the air. But he will have to load the previously inside legs so that they track ahead of the outside legs. In connection with collecting the canter, it has already been pointed out what important task is performed by the outside hind leg. In the flying change, its activity is also decisive for the fluent performance of this movement in which the footfalls are different from before. The outside hind leg is the pillar that supports the body and must enable the other limbs to securely change their sequence of footfalls. For this purpose, they must receive the weight, and the new inside hind leg must be enabled to remain in the air and swing forward, which it must simultaneously be asked to do by an aid from the rider's leg at the girth. Before the change, the rider will therefore already ask the new outside hind leg to jump forward well underneath the load and will have to take care that it is flexed. This is possible only by setting the horse straight and collecting it. Moving the rider's weight backward and half halts in the direction toward the previously inside hind leg, which has been pulled forward by the rider's leg on the same side, will ensure both. After this preparation, the change of aids takes place. The hand begins with the change of position, and the rider's legs likewise change their position immediately thereafter. To do this, the previously outside leg of the rider initially slides toward the girth, and the other leg almost simultaneously slides behind the girth. The former has the task of making the new left side hollow and asking the hind leg on the same side to swing forward lively. The previously inside leg of the rider must direct the hindquarters onto the line. At the moment of the change, the rider must sit up more, hollow his back, and push his inside hip and inside seat bone forward without moving his leg on the same side further forward than to the girth. He must, with his seat, seem to want to throw the horse forward upward in a straight direction, with his new inside leg acting a little stronger, and with the new inner side being allowed to lead. The rider's weight is then directed more toward the new outside seat bone. As in all other exercises, the flying change must first be taught to the horse. To do this, the necessary aids, which when performed to perfection almost flow into one another, must be separated from one another, the rein aids coming first, then the leg aids, with the seat aids bringing the change to completion. The procedure should be similar when teaching the young rider to perform the change of lead. Particular care must be taken right from the start that the horse remains precisely on the line, but the young rider does not look down or throw himself over to the side. Before one can begin with the practice of changing leads, the straight canter depart on both leads from the trot as well as from the walk, and the simple change of lead at the canter must be perfectly secure on a straight, open track, and must be performed as a result of light, invisible aids. Before beginning the first exercises of flying changes, one should be convinced that these prerequisites are met. Likewise, the horse must be easily collected at the canter on a straight, open track, and must remain completely straight and through. There are several methods for practicing flying changes of lead, and many riders, particularly those who are not trained in dressage, use the moment to change the horse from one position on a curved line, indicated by its position, to another inversely curved line. Others perform the first changes of lead from the counter-canter by cantering along the wall and completely changing their aids when they reach a corner, using primarily the new inside rein and outside leg. However, to teach the horse to change in a straightforward direction under all circumstances, it is advantageous to practice the changes also on a straight track. Best suited for this purpose is the diagonal through the whole arena. As soon as one steps on this line, one must take care that the horse is set completely straight and canters quietly. If this is the case, one should begin, as soon as one is approximately in the center of the arena, to increasingly collect the horse. Particular care should be taken to keep the horse straight, through, and cantering relaxed, but diligently. If this is the case, one begins with changing its position and should arrange it so that this is completed shortly before the new track line is entered. As mentioned earlier, the aids for the change must be given separately from one another, in such a way that the rein aids come first, the leg aids follow, and the seat aids complete the change when the change point is reached. If the horse becomes restless already during the preparatory collection and pushes sideways, the change must not yet be performed, because all these phenomena indicate clearly that the horse is not yet ready for this new lesson. Moreover, one must at first not repeat the change of lead too frequently, and not always at the same location in the arena, but must interject pauses or in between ride the same tracks without changes. Also, one must always be convinced that the horse continues to perform the simple change securely and quietly. As in all other movements, the prompt and correct performance is dependent here, aside from the already frequently emphasized suitable preparation, primarily on the detection of the correct moments for giving the aids. This is a matter of equestrian tact and experience, which can be acquired only by much practice. Whoever understands that a good flying change can only be performed from the period of suspension, and that the individual tempi of the canter movement follow one another extremely quickly and almost flow into one another, will also be aware that the aids must begin already before the period of suspension. The preparatory collecting half-halt will have to be given at the movement when the previously outside hind leg sets down. The change of position, however, must follow immediately thereafter, when the legs of the outside diagonal step down. Such quick and prompt interaction of the aids can be accomplished only with increasing practice by the thus perfected feeling. The further training must continue on the basis achieved by the above described exercises for a single flying change, if one wishes to turn to the development of repeated successive flying changes, particularly after a set number of strides. One must not begin any earlier than when the horse is able to perform a change to the right or left lead easily and regularly at any location in the arena. In the beginning, one should be satisfied to produce a single change to either lead after a certain larger number of canter strides, that is, 8 or 10, and one's demands should only very gradually be raised with respect to the repetition of the frequency of the changes, and with respect to the reduction of the number of canter strides in between. As soon as the horse displays excitement, one should return to the simpler exercises. But if the horse performs the requested changes well, one must always intend to perform a certain number and must not exceed that number. it should be praised, and a pause should be interjected, or the day's work should be terminated completely. Slow and systematic progress on the correct basis is the most reliable way to arrive at one's goal. If one remains faithful to these principles, as should be a matter of course for the true expert, and the physical talents of the horse permit it, one will finally arrive at a point where the flying changes can be performed every stride. However, such changes can be considered proper dressage movements only if they are performed precisely on a straightforward line without any noticeable aids from the rider, particularly without any non-equestrian and unsightly throwing of the upper body from side to side, as is unfortunately seen very frequently today. In order to avoid repetition, the so often emphasized principle that pace and contact must always be the touchstone for the correctness of our work has no longer been referred to in connection with the last exercises at the Canter. However, at the end of this important chapter, the urgent admonition must once more be repeated, even at the risk of becoming boring, that one should immediately change to a freer, more lively canter in order to refresh the thrust as soon as any kind of insufficiencies in pace and contact become evident. If correctly riding forward is the soul of all equestrian art, this is particular. And notes for section C7, all from Hans von Heidebrecht. 1. The strong holding of the weights in the rider's hand, as recommended for this purpose in earlier editions, must lead to renewed tension. The hands must hold tight only if this is possible without the exertion of force, or if the lively spring action of the hind legs need no longer be asked for through spurs and whip. 2. However, with his straightening bending work, the rider must not make the mistake of letting the neck flap toward the left against the shoulder. Instead, he should attempt to obtain the bend to the left primarily with his inside leg and spur, and not with the left rein. 3. To work travers-like in the shoulder in means to give the horse the correct longitudinal bend with the rider's outside leg behind the girt, and asking the horse's outside hind leg to step forward and underneath in the direction of the lateral position. To work shoulder-in-like in the travers means for the rider to use his inside leg to ask the horse's inside hind leg to step forward against the gravity line and to thus prevent it from escaping toward the inside. 4. In the earlier editions, the urgent requirement was made at this point that every horse that is supposed to be on the bit must move with a bent neck and its nose vertical, and it was added that there is no neck and no pull that could free the rider from the requirement of putting the nose vertical, or at least almost vertical. This position was represented as a sign that the horse had given up any resistance in the pull. Such a schematic requirement obviously contradicts Steinbrecht's principles as laid out in the preceding paragraphs, and cannot even be found in the chapter dealing with the bending of neck and pull. For the above detailed reasons, it cannot be maintained, and has therefore been omitted. 5. Seidler generally recommends double side reins, which have a similar effect as the side reins described in connection with work on the lunge, except that the rider has the upper ends in his hands. With shaky heads, these auxiliary reins serve their purpose, since they prevent the neck from escaping to the side. 6. Primarily, it will be the horse's crookedness, even after it appears to have been overcome, that creates difficulties in every new exercise. It never leaves us until the end and appears to a greater or lesser degree even in a perfectly trained dressage horse. It must be eradicated again and again through bending work on 1 and 2 tracks. 7. To obtain a clear picture of the moment at which the aids for collecting the canter must act, one must observe the movement of the horse's body during a canter stride. One will then note that both forehand and hindquarters are raised and lowered alternatively. At the moment at which the inside foreleg solely supports the body weight and pushes it off, the forehand is lower than the hindquarters, while conversely the hindquarters are lowered and the forehand is raised as soon as the horse, after the period of suspension, catches the weight again on only the outside hind leg. The entire swivel block thus constantly performs a movement similar to the whipping of a scale bar. If the rider closely follows this rhythm, his upper body will perform a movement that oscillates back and forth from the vertical position, and his arms and hands will do the same. At the movement at which the hindquarters are lowered, the hands and arms will move back automatically so that the half halt is produced automatically. The rider's legs, however, are slightly pushed away from the horse's body when the latter is pushed together the most, that is in the period of suspension, and drop back against it again when it is stretched out. This results automatically in the rider's natural, cadenced leg aids. 8. Even though particular attention must be paid to working the inside hind leg during the first collection of the canter, so as to cause the leg to step underneath the weight and prevent it from escaping toward the inside, the outside hind leg has the main task in the collected canter. It must not only, as indicated above, catch the weight, but also bend under it and spring off again elastically by softly catching the entire load with loose joints and pushing it off again with liveliness, thus ensuring softness as well as impulsion of movement. 9. The disadvantageous consequences of such attempts at forcing the hind legs to bend are manifest in jerky movements in which the hocks try to free themselves of this forced-on load by short jerks. Not infrequently, this results in the so-called string halt, or even spavin or other diseases of the hocks and fetlock joints. 10. This is recommended primarily to overcome crookedness in the counter-canter. 11. The travers canter should be demanded only with a slight lateral deviation, but in good collection, which must be characterized primarily by softly pushed together hindquarters that are supple and resilient in their upper joints. The hands should be limited to slight cadenced half halts, while the rider's legs, also vibrating in cadence, ask the hind legs to jump under in a lively manner. The rider must feel as if he had the major portion of the horse's body in front of him. 12. The 3-beat will become a 4-beat already with the development of the dressage canter, but this phenomenon must not be discernible with the naked eye, since it otherwise would indicate that the movement has become dragging. 13. The opinion represented here that the pirouette is more beautiful the fewer strides the horse requires for the entire turn does not correspond to the principles of classical equitation. The latter does not evaluate the performance of all turns about the hindquarters by their speed, and also not by the number of strides they require, but according to whether the rhythm of the strides and the horse's balanced position remain exactly the same during the entire revolution as they were immediately before. The horse must continue to canter or redop, must not become faster or fall sideways, and after completion of the turn, must continue at once to canter straight on the track on which the turn was initiated. 14. In an underestimation of the importance of this exercise for practical use, the earlier editions only indicated the development of the flying change and gave the advice not to make this change the subject of a special exercise, but to wait until, in the course of the work, the horse would perform its changes with increasing skill and reliability, which would automatically bring about the flying change after a while. This neither corresponds to facts nor the practical significance of this exercise. It has therefore been necessary to discuss this subject in greater detail, particularly also in view of the fact that in recent times the flying change is required in almost all dressage tests, and is often performed incorrectly. 15. Philly, who unquestionably was a master in the performance of the flying change, and was the first who performed changes every stride to perfection, initially used this method, but then practiced it mainly on a straight line.
Thanks again to Classical Audio Horsebooks and Gold Leaf Farms for this reading from Gustav Steinbrecht's Gymnasium of the Horse. Join us again for the next RT podcast.